Echoes of the Arab Spring. From Cairo to Alexandria, calls for President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's resignation are sparking a wave of dissent across Egypt. But will they succeed? I'm Imran Garda, and today on The Newsmakers, we look at the latest round of anti-government demonstrations in Egypt. Donald Trump earlier this month referred to Egypt's president as, quote, his favorite dictator. If that phrase had been uttered in public by an Egyptian, the person would very likely have been thrown in prison. Criticizing Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, calling him names or protesting against his government have been illegal ever since he deposed Egypt's first democratically elected president and took power in 2013. But it seems the thousands of people who are demanding he step down are prepared to risk arrest or what's referred to as forced disappearances. The protests were triggered after a former military contractor called Mohamed Ali began posting videos online from outside the country alleging he had evidence of widespread government corruption and misuse of public funds. Sisi says the allegations are lies and has responded by ordering a police crackdown that's seen hundreds of people taken into custody. But in Sisi's Egypt, with conflicting reports on how many are protesting and how many have been arrested, it's difficult to get an accurate idea of exactly what's happening on the ground. So let's ask Amr Magdi in Berlin about the disputed numbers. He's a researcher at the East and North Africa division of Human Rights Watch. Amr, good to have you back on the Newsmakers. What's the clearest, most reliable estimate of how many people were protesting and how many people are in jail?
Well, I think we are talking about thousands who took to the streets on Friday and Saturday nights. I think the question of numbers is not really a smart question because it's usually used by the governments trying to discredit or to minimize the significance of the process. But actually, in the view of many analysts, and I am one of them, I think these are the most significant protests, anti-government protests since late 2013. And actually, their significance is not just measured by the numbers who talk to the streets, but also by millions participating in hashtags on social media, and also by the pro-government and government hysteria to crush the protests. We are talking about around 1,000 people arrested in the last 3 days only, and the numbers are perhaps increasing as we speak because the government is trying to identify and track down those who participated in the protests and also activists calling for the protests. We are talking about journalists arrested for doing their work covering the protests, at least 3 of them. We are talking about lawyers supporting the detainees, also arrested. We are talking about terrorism accusations given to the detainees. And you can also see the kind of shock and denial, state of denial in the articles by those journalists close to Sisi, and the employment of these old weapons, such as these funny video clips by famous artists trying to show or say words of praise to Sisi and love to Egypt and so on, which are the same old tactics that Mubarak's disposed government used to deploy whenever they felt threatened. So these all signs that these are very significant protests, and their significance also stem from the fact that protesters come from all backgrounds, from all ideological ideas and backgrounds, and it's not a specific party or a specific political power that's calling for such protests.
So, Amr, we know there were protests in Cairo, in Alexandria, in Port Suez, and so on, right? We also know, as you mentioned, people are sharing and using hashtags and people are engaged online. We've got reports of the government trying to choke social media and to try and minimize people's ability to share things on social media. Have they been able to still get the message across despite the restrictions?
I think they did. You can see that from the millions of people who participated in those hashtags and tweets and Facebook events, and also the fact that the protests actually continued on Saturday and to a smaller extent on Sunday, even though Mohamed Ali didn't actually call for protests on Saturday and Sunday. You can also see it in the amount of protests across the globe from Egyptians living abroad. And that's actually also, I believe, the first time since 2011 that we see Egyptian diaspora in so many cities across the globe participating in protests in solidarity with their fellow citizens inside Egypt. So I think they managed to get the word disseminated and spread. However, we see increasing intensifying crackdown by the government. We see more websites blocked. They just blocked BBC and Al Hurra. And yesterday, last night, actually Twitter, around half of the users in Egypt are not able to access Twitter anymore. And my fear, my concern as a human rights observer is that the government will move to shut down the internet and to continue to take measures to cover up for the abuses committed by security forces. We fear that the security forces will escalate violence to the level of use of lethal weapons, shooting protesters as they did before, and it went unpunished. These are all legitimate concerns, and the government seems to have learned no lesson at all from the 7-year-long operation.
Okay, Amr Magdi, thanks so much for giving us that perspective from Human Rights Watch. Let's discuss this further. Timothy Kaldas joins us from Boston. He's a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Emily Hawthorne is in Austin, Texas. She's a Middle East and North Africa analyst at Stratfor, a geopolitical intelligence platform. And in London is Mustafa Ragab, the founder of the UK-Egyptian Association. Mustafa Ragab, let's start with you. More than 500 people detained. Seems to be a situation where the government's facing people power. People are not happy. They're taking to the streets and the government's cracking down.
When we say people are not happy, we have to remember that Egypt is over 100 million population now. So if we have a few people unhappy, that's expected. You cannot keep everyone happy. But what is happening in Egypt at the moment, the Brotherhood have failed 3 times now. They have failed to control the streets of Egypt. They have failed in their media campaign they're doing. So now they are trying their best to make use of everything there to get the people in the street pretending that it's not a Brotherhood move. It is Egyptians' move. People soon realize that it's the Brotherhood behind this move, and they withdraw from what they convince him with. What we have to look at the figures that is being said. There is any proof for this figure, but okay. What we need to look at.
But do you have any proof that it's the Brotherhood?
Sorry?
Do you have any proof that it's the Brotherhood?
Oh, yes, of course, because as soon as they mention anything about Morsi or about Rabaa, the people are with them, they leave them. That's the proof that they are Brotherhood. But what I want to say is...
no proof that they're Brotherhood.
That is the proof I'm giving you. That as soon as they mention Morsi or Rabaa, the people with them, they leave them. But when you say it's around the globe, that's not true. Talk about London. Here in London, we've had 20 people on Saturday, 30 people on Sunday outside the Egyptian embassy. More than half of them are not Egyptians. They are trying to campaign with those people under the Islamic umbrella. There is nothing against Islam. No, I haven't finished. Let me finish. Let me finish. And what I'm saying there is that if you want to believe Mohamed Ali, the druggie, it's up to you to believe him.
But it's interesting though. But the interesting thing about Mohamed Ali, I mean, on the one hand, pro-government media was saying he is possibly Brotherhood, possibly Ikhwan. And then when that didn't check out, they said, well, he's a druggie and he's a womanizer and he has no morals and he's godless. So I don't know. The government needs to make up its mind, looking at it from the outside, get its story straight, don't you think, Mr. Ragab?
The Egyptian government are facing the most difficult time that no other government is facing. They're facing the enemy abroad and they're facing the enemy from within.
Okay.
They are fighting a lot of terrorism and they're trying to rebuild the country.
Okay.
They're trying to do that that's been happening in all these years.
Okay,
And
fair enough. Okay, and I wanted to understand
This
this
process.
perspective. Okay, and I wanted to give you a bit of time up front to give you the full opportunity to express yourself. Timothy Kaldas, is anything that Mustafa Ragab making sense to you about the nature of the protests and where they might come from?
Not really. I mean, to be perfectly frank, there's no evidence to support the idea that this is a Brotherhood-led protest. And as you rightly pointed out, initially they tried to say that, but ultimately we have Mohamed Ali, who is an individual who was a contractor with servicing the military and its projects, been vetted by the security apparatus. If he was actually Brotherhood, there's no way they would have allowed that to happen. And as you rightly pointed out, they turned from saying he was an Islamist to saying he drinks and womanizes. So clearly they're just picking whichever piece of propaganda they can to try to discredit him. But ultimately it shows that they don't really have anything to stand on. With respect to Ragab's point about the small numbers, I think you have to measure that against the fact that there's extraordinary risk in protesting, whether it be the possibility of being arrested and held for years in prison, perhaps without trial. On top of that, there's a consistent use of torture in Egyptian prisons. Beyond that, we have a number of people who've been killed in protests. And so the fact that you have even thousands of people willing to go that far represents an enormous amount of anger behind them.
Right. Okay.
And I think that if you fail to see that, then...
Right. Okay, so let me bring in Emily Hawthorne, because that's an interesting point, right? Emily, I remember years ago when I used to visit Egypt, people would say, Egyptians will never rise up against Mubarak. It's impossible. You should even whisper in cafes and you shouldn't even talk about this, right? And it was seen as a major act of courage and faith and breaking a psychological barrier to rise up against the Mubarak regime. Now people are saying something similar, that it was almost unthinkable to rise up against Sisi or even go out onto the streets, be it 5 people, 10 people, or 500 people. But this shows a shift. Is that shift in evidence, Emily? Well, hold on for just a second, Emily. We don't have your audio, so I think we're just going to try and raise your audio again. Yeah, okay. So, Emily, we're going to come back to you. Can't hear you, so we're going to come back to you in just a couple of seconds. Timothy, I want you to address that then. Has it been evidence that this is a psychological barrier that has been transcended, and it's the biggest moment since 2013?
It's definitely the first time we see widespread political protests taking place in multiple governorates throughout the country. Previous times when we've seen any sort of protest that takes place across the country has more of an economic motivation, such as... However, I would add that it's premature to determine whether or not this past weekend will really break that barrier of fear. Right. And bring things forward with an increased mobilization. It's certainly very possible that seeing people finally take that step and protest and call for the fall of the regime, that more might be encouraged to do so. Right. But it's hard to know for sure.
Mustafa Ragab, why not listen to the people? Why so easy to just say, hey, these are Brotherhood, these are Islamists, they want to destroy Egypt and so on. Boilerplate stuff, right? Why not listen to them? Maybe they have some legitimate grievances because they're not happy with the way their country is being run.
We have to listen to the people if they're behaving in the right manner, if they're using the right words, if they're not going out to destroy everything in front of them, if they have the right language to speak, you have to listen to them. But what you're having there is people who are misbehaving themselves, going out to destroy, going out to do anything that causes problems. When you want to oppose anything, when you want to say your opinion, if I talk about even the social media that we have, the kind of people on social media, the language they're using and their behavior is outrageous.
Okay, but certainly, Mr. Ragab, historically,
Present yourself.
No person ever upset with their government has said, respectfully, sir, I politely disagree with the way you're running my country, right? This is what happens. This is what happens when people are angry. Emily Hawthorne, we can hear you now, so let's bring Emily in. Emily, jump
It's
into
not
the
what you
conversation.
say, it's
Okay,
not what you
go
say,
ahead,
it's
Emily.
what
I wanted
you
to
say.
say, I wanted to say that when
What
I
you
was in
say
Egypt
is
in
not
2011 and 2012, there was it was a unique time where Egyptians could talk politically, and I do think now that there is fear about what Egyptians can and cannot say. But I really wanted to cast attention on one of the motivations for why we have seen Egyptians come out in the street over the last weekend. And it has a lot to do with the economy. And this is just another facet of what's driving people to come out there, is that we have seen under the Sisi presidency some stabilization of the economy, but that's on the macroeconomic level. In terms of what Egyptians day to day feel and in terms of what they have and jobs and security, that is missing for a lot of Egyptians. We know that a third of Egyptians live in poverty. And yes, the Sisi government has done some of what it can to try and recast cash transfer programs like Takaful and Karama, but they've also implemented austerity measures and in accordance with a massive IMF plan. And some of that has been great for government finances, but it has not been good for Egyptians' pocketbooks and for Egyptians' sense of economic security. And I think that that's one of the things we have to pay attention to when we see a legitimate wellspring of people on the streets. And that's not all the reasons, but that's one of them to pay attention to here.
Mustafa Ragab, do you accept that the economy is not doing too well and that's why people are not happy?
No, I don't accept that at all. And people who are talking about they can't live and they can do and can do that, I go on the pages and I found that they well-off people. The poor people actually, they don't say nothing. The poor people are living happily. It's the people who are earning the money that going on social media protesting on behalf of the poor people.
That's
I
simply
challenge
untrue.
you, if you go into anyone who complain on his page and find that he's poor. This is false. But the Egyptian economy, not by me, by other economy establishment, saying that the Egyptian economy is reviving. Egypt is going in the right direction to improve the economy. This is what the economist people saying, not me.
Okay, which
No, it
which
depends on
economist?
which element
If
you're
I
looking
could
at.
just
Okay,
answer
okay,
that.
Mr. Ragab. Okay, so hold on, Emily, for 1 second. Which economist, Mr. Ragab?
You get that from America, from France. You've got the reports about the Egyptian economy, about the deficit. All these reports are coming out to show
Any specific report you have in mind that you want to share with us?
No, I don't have anything
Okay.
specific in my mind right now, but it
Okay.
is on all the national and international papers.
Okay, Emily Hawthorne, why aren't you reading the papers?
So that's exactly where the disconnect is, though. Macroeconomically, Egypt is doing better. We've seen Egypt was at red alert levels for its reserves. It had 3 months worth of imports, the amount of money to buy 3 months worth of imports in 2016. That was one of the reasons why they agreed to the MENA region's largest ever IMF program in 2016. And yes, Egypt has great potential in terms of FDI. It's one of Africa's greatest destinations for FDI. It has oil and gas exploration that looks very promising. There are all sorts of indicators that are doing better for Egypt, but there are also all sorts of indicators that show that Egyptians are not seeing that in their pocketbooks. They're not seeing that in terms of job security. They're not seeing that translate into the unemployment level changing at all for them. And young Egyptians are still worried about the future. And
Right.
I think that that's something that you have to pay attention to, is there's a
Right.
disconnect between macroeconomically and microeconomically what's happening.
Timothy Kaldas, I want to ask about the binary, where if you're not with Sisi, then you're Ikhwan, and if you're not Ikhwan, then you're with Sisi. This brotherhood Sisi thing, it seems to be pretty stale to me many years on, but people still use it, and we've seen the government use it, and Mr. Ragab has used it in response now when we talk about protests against President Sisi. Tell me why that persists and what's wrong with it, Timothy.
I mean, it's an old trope. I mean, even under Mubarak, he regularly went to the West and said it's either me or the Islamists. This idea that Egyptians can't imagine beyond these two possible poles. The reality is that a lot of Egyptians hate both the Brotherhood and Sisi at this point. He was very popular when he first seized power, and and even took office. But as Emily pointed out, while the macro picture is improving on the individual level, most Egyptians have seen a substantial drop in their standard of living due to the increase of pricing and the collapse of the value of the currency. Beyond that, while FDI is, she said, is fairly high with oil and gas, outside of oil and gas, there's almost no FDI at all because the military has been expanding dramatically its role in the economy, scaring away investors, both domestic and foreign. And Egyptians have grown frustrated by the fact that the president keeps calling for belt tightening, while at the same time distributing largesse to the military as they're the backbone of his regime and building palaces by his own admission, while a third of the Egyptians at least are in poverty. And so all these things have provoked people quite a bit. I think that the reality is that most Egyptians are political free agents. They don't have a history of supporting any particular party. And that's reflected when you speak to people who frankly just dislike and distrust everyone these days.
World leaders descended in New York for the United Nations General Assembly, and President Sisi was there, shoulder to shoulder. Well, he's a little bit shorter than Donald Trump, but shoulder to shoulder with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump was asked about the protests in Egypt. Have a little listen to what he said.
I guess everybody has demonstrations, even your best friend in the whole world, President Obama, he had a lot of demonstrations. No, I'm not concerned with it. Egypt has a great leader. He's highly respected. He's brought order. Before he was here, there was very little order. There was chaos. And so I'm not worried about that.
Mustafa Ragab, you've got Donald Trump's backing. Are you happy about that?
I'm happy to have the backing of everybody, not just Donald Trump. We have the backing of Germany, we have the backing of France, we have the backing of a lot of people around the world because they know what's going on in Egypt. Egypt now is the only country that is standing to fight against terrorism. If anyone else was having this fight against terrorism, they wouldn't have the time or the resources or anything to do anything else. We are having a huge fight. And when you say the brotherhood is an old thing, it's not an old thing, it's a fact. They are very powerful. They supported financially and by media from foreign countries who wants to bring Egypt down. Egypt is the only country in the Middle East that left standing on its feet. Egypt is the only country in the Middle East that still got an army that can defend the country and can do other things across the region. Egypt is there to remain, despite what very few people don't like it. And I will remind you, I said we're over 100 million. So if you have 500,000 people unhappy, that is a very good percentage. We have to look at the majority, not the few people.
Okay, so I want to ask Emily Hawthorne. Okay, hold on. Okay, Mr. Ragab, hold on for a second. So, Emily, we're having Donald Trump here showing support. There's protests in Egypt. It doesn't seem to bother him. Timothy said, it's almost an old trope where Mubarak used to also use it, where it's either us or the Islamists. Is that what drives Donald Trump and others to support President Sisi no matter what?
Well, when you look at what the United States and particularly this administration wants out of its Middle Eastern partners, and remember that Donald Trump in his first foreign trip went to Saudi Arabia and said, we want partners, not perfection. What they want out of their partners is capable armies that they can work with and that they can put the burden onto them to fight terrorists that the United States views as a security risk for the region and for the US and for the world. And they also want energy stability and security. And they are not too concerned about many other issues in the Middle East, frankly, especially compared to previous administrations. They're especially not as concerned about human rights issues on the ground. So as long as Egypt is a stable partner in terms of what it's offering, in terms of mill-to-mill cooperation and buying U.S. arms, I don't think that this administration is going to be too bothered about what's happening on the streets in Egypt.
Timothy Kaldas, is that the geopolitical realpolitik?
I think that the reality is that this actually predates even the Trump administration. The unfortunate reality is that most U.S. presidents have been comfortable dealing with authoritarians to further what they believe are the vital U.S. interests in the region. And Egypt's partnership with the United States has never really been predicated on respect for human rights. There's been consistent violation of those under Obama, under Republican and Democratic presidents. And I mean, if we even look at the Obama administration's support for Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, we can see quite clearly that human rights did not figure prominently in their list of priorities.
And Timothy, personal question for you, because I know you do spend a lot of your time at home in Cairo. Given the current atmosphere, do you sometimes worry that you have to watch what you say, either in a program like this or on social media and so on, because it might get you in trouble when you go back home to Cairo?
There's a consistent risk, but I mean, I'm more privileged than many in terms of my ability to speak on these issues. There's so many Egyptians who are political prisoners right now, and I'd rather focus on them, who, by virtue of just practicing journalism, or a friend of mine, Ziad Al-Alemi, who wanted to just run for parliament in accordance with the laws set by Sisi and his government. He was arrested for that and faces ridiculous charges. And they've tried to claim that he's a Brotherhood member when he's a leftist secularist. It's a really dangerous situation for Egyptians who seek to speak in Arabic in particular, and bravely criticize this regime.
Okay, Tim, I've got a wrap. Timothy, Emily, and Mustafa, it's been a pleasure having you all on the Newsmakers. We'll keep a close eye on the situation in Egypt. Thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. And thank you so much for joining us. Join us next time. Bye-bye.